Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Mari Thurger and today I'm going to answer an interesting question, at least I find it interesting, a question that has popped out on my latest video, the magic formula, Alu, concerning that runic inscription. So another question came up concerning the runic inscription SueuS, found in the rune stone G88. The runic inscription G88 on the Kylver Stone from Gotland, Sweden, and what possible meaning it bears. I'll cut this short for you and tell you right away, unfortunately, there isn't much to say about that particular runic inscription. It is a palindrome, no doubt, and not just because of the choice of runes and each representative letter, but because each of the two S runes is turned to a different side, which really indicates that it was meant to show that it is a palindrome. Perhaps for those who could not read it, they would be immediately able to identify it is a palindrome, and so they would perhaps copy that sequence of runes in or for a specific purpose in a specific context for which we know nothing about. So it is indeed a possibility that for those who could not read and write or identify the letters in those runic characters, or simply write and read runes to express a specific purpose, they would visually identify a known magic purpose simply by the choice of specific characters, and the last runic character reversed in relation to the first equal character would give them an indication of a magic formula, and so it was used even without knowing the written meaning but simply knowing it and knowing it is a palindrome. And it's precisely because of this, for being a palindrome, that it is considered a magic term or related to magic or a magical formula, as are all things we don't find an immediate meaning or use for. The idea that it is magical is drawn from the comparison with Gnostic palindromes, one of which, perhaps the most famous and used, is the palindrome ᛋᚢᚖᚋ. So no matter how you read it, be it from left to right or right to left, it's always the same word, right? Or perhaps another very famous example that has been highly used for centuries and in European magic and all over the place, and many people tattoo it, is the famous Sator square. No matter how you read it, all words follow the same sequence. The Sator square is a very good example to illustrate this, because there's no meaning for it. We don't know the original meaning. No one knows its purpose or what it actually means and why was it created in the first place. And so it has become one of the most used formulas or a formula in magic, even though its purpose and meaning is not known. So that's the same thing we have with this runic formula. There isn't any knowledge of its meaning and purpose, and so it has become known as a magic formula, a runic magical formula. So that's what is truly known concerning the magic and purpose of this runic magic formula. Nothing at all. So, as you might expect, there's plenty of suppositions and possible interpretations for it, simply because there are no clear clues, so it's just opened to interpretation. And I'm not just talking about in esoteric terms or even esoteric runology, I'm also speaking within academia. Many possible interpretations. However, no actual evidences to support such interpretations, the great majority of the interpretations around this. Now, what intrigues me the most is that this rune stone was dated to 400 of the Common Era, based on the archaeological dating of the local graves. It does present Elder Futhark runes. However, the SueuS inscription uses the S Rune, which you can see right here somewhere on the screen, of the younger Futhark, which only appeared in the 8th century, as evidenced by other rune stones of the same period, with S runes equivalent to the younger Futhark and not the elder one, not the elder Futhark one, which I'll put on the screen as well, which would have been more likely, taking into consideration both the dating of the stone and the fact that the stone itself presents the runic character representative of S in the other inscription, the first inscription. So it's strange that the SueuS inscription, the second inscription, presents a type of S rune that does not correspond to the S rune known at the time, and instead whoever inscribed this particular formula, the second one, chose a much later rune for S. Now, we have three possible scenarios here, and please bear it with me. First, the stone may be a forgery. Calm down. Some authors have proposed that, which wouldn't be surprising, unfortunately, given the time when it was found, when the runestone was found. And many European countries, by that time, many European countries, were extensively making forgeries. Some well-known ones are still in display in museums. If you want my honest opinion, I don't believe it is a forgery. Although perhaps that's because I don't want to believe it is a forgery. Because the Kylver Stone displays the assumed, or better still, the accepted sequence of the Elder Futhark, as we know it. And since its finding, there's been plenty of studies, and if we would now come to the conclusion that it is, after all, a forgery, more than 90% of what has been written and studied concerning the earliest runic inscriptions in Germanic context following the sequence of the Elder Futhark would be thrown into the garbage. So, at this point, even if it were a forgery, I don't think anyone would be able to, or even have the courage to come forth and expose that, because everything would go down into flames, right into the dirt. But I just want to express here in a few words why it is so difficult to know if it is a forgery or not, and why I am wary concerning this particular finding. Many of you who already follow this channel for some time know that I am an archaeologist digging artifacts with the proper study of the strata, dating the context itself, the environment, where the objects are found, etc., is one thing. Another is when a forgery is made and you, as an archaeologist, you are not prepared to deal with it because you don't have the practical knowledge on how to work the materials, on how to shape that particular object. So things changed for me back in 2018, 4 years ago as of this video, when after my degree in history and archaeology as well, I have made a course and an unpaid internship for a whole year. Good gods, it was awful. An internship concerning restoration of archaeological artifacts. I gained a lot of new experience that has helped me a lot, quite a lot actually, in archaeology. A lot of experience in terms of materials, how they work, how they were produced, the elements in them, etc. If you are going to make a restoration of an actual archaeological artifact, which is quite fragile, you do have to know its entire structure and composition in order to apply the proper materials and chemicals to clean it up and restore it without breaking it and completely destroy it. The person who taught me all about it, before coming to the side of the good guys, to the science team, had worked for several decades in antiquary establishments, right? He produced several forgeries. It's a fascinating culture in itself, and to be honest, I admire these bastards because it's not just skill and patience and know-how and practical terms and building something from scratch. These guys are truly artists, but it's also the amount of knowledge concerning archaeology, history, real artifacts and materials to make it look like the real thing. It's obviously an absolutely fascinating, in a frightening sense. To this day, there are still thousands of forgeries being made that miraculously are found by some archaeologist or an amateur, or even a sign of the gods or a divine sign and the right to rule a people when a president of a modern country finds such an historical artifact. This is still being done, but it used to be more intensive, of course, precisely by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when the Kylver Stone was precisely found, which is the one we are dealing with in here today. Sometimes it's the tiniest detail that gives it away. Sometimes the forgery is so well done that no one will notice until an absolute expert, wizard or something on the matter comes closer to the actual object and finds something. So I am wary concerning these things since 2018, because by restoring actual artifacts I became aware how easy it is to make a forgery and make it look like the real thing, provided that you have the materials for it. However, materials can be dated, obviously. Organic materials are easier to date. Wood can be dated, even metal and its components can be dated, which demonstrates the techniques that were used and the environments the metals have been exposed to. However, it isn't easy to date stones. A stone is a stone. Just because a stone has millions of years and has an inscription on it, obviously doesn't mean the inscription itself has equally millions of years. You can date the stone, but you cannot date the inscription. Or just because a stone rolled down into a place during the last glacial period and has an inscription on it, doesn't mean the inscription is approximately 12,000 years old. The stone may be ancient, but the inscription or any carvings on it can even have been done yesterday, and we may never know if the forgery is truly well done. As I've pointed out on the video concerning the ᛋᚢᚖᚢᚋ labyrinth, it was possible to date the carvings on the stone because of lichenometry, which is the method of dating lichen growth to determine the age of exposed rock. Or, for instance, when lichen grows on top of a carving, we know that the carving itself is prior to the growth of the lichen when the lichen was exposed. That's a good method. However, no such thing was possible with the Kylver Stone. The very dating of the stone isn't based on the stone itself and on the carvings, but on the grave context surrounding it. This is important to mention because for a long time it was thought that the runic inscription on the Kylver Stone, or the runic inscriptions, plural, were in relation to the dead, to the deceased. So, some sort of magic formulas for the dead. But there is no evidence whatsoever that the inscription or the inscriptions were made for a purpose related to the grave and the deceased. So it's quite probable that the date of the inscription or the inscriptions may be after the 5th century. There are plenty of examples of both. Stones in specific contexts that have later been added to them, inscriptions that have nothing to do with such contexts, but also stones with inscriptions that are reused and moved into other contexts that have nothing to do with the original context, and a lot of information is lost along the way. So, you see why it is very difficult to date this specific example and why the inscriptions could have been made in periods that have nothing to do with the context in there. There are around 400 inscriptions using the older Futhark runes, which isn't a lot, by the way, and they span from the 2nd to the 7th century of the Common Era. However, there are just and only 4 known early inscriptions containing complete or near complete Futharks of what has been accepted as the first runic alphabets. One of which is precisely, and probably the earliest, if we assume to be the real deal, was carved on the limestone slab at Kylver, Gotland in Sweden. Accepted or conventionally dated to the 5th century, although uncertain for the very reasons expressed previously. And we see one inscription with a sequence of runes as the accepted standardized form of the so-called Elder Futhark. And then there's a second inscription, which is the one we are dealing with here on this video today. Again, the functions of these carvings aren't known, and each of the inscriptions may be from different periods or from different contexts and done by different peoples and reused in here, or having been done later on by completely different peoples from different periods. Now, let's focus on the SueuS inscription, the second one, which by itself could be a forgery, just the one a forgery and not the rest. Given the fact that instead of using the rune representative of the S letter, we find in the first inscription, which indicates its more ancient period, since that character derives directly from the Mediterranean alphabets that have been introduced to Germanic peoples, and thus forming the oldest runic characters in Germanic context. So, instead of that particular character, it was used instead another runic character for S, which is from a much later period. It has been suggested, of course, that the S rune used in here is in fact an early variation, which some would argue that indeed it is a variation from the oldest S rune, more or less in the same periods, and therefore, well, this indicates that both inscriptions are of the same period. Although, there's no reason to use one specific runic character for the letter S in one inscription and right after it, next to it, use a completely different character for the same letter during the same period, unless, of course, the second inscription, the SueuS one, is from a later period or done by a different person. Because using the S letter like a lightning bolt, it's actually a rune which either only occurs in Old Italic script, either Etruscan or Latin, having fallen into disuse in the 1st century before the Common Era, almost 300 years before the runes were introduced to Germanic peoples, and the first S rune in Germanic context was always the one that looks like a sharp 3, or the lightning bolt S used in the 1930s in Germany as the Sieg or victory rune, which would demonstrate that this runic inscription forming a palindrome was actually made later on after the discovery of the stone itself. This could lead to further discussion, as some authors defend that the lightning bolt S rune, right, is a variation in development between the 5th and the 6th centuries, although it is only found in the Kylver Stone, to my knowledge. Or, of course, there's another example, the Kylver spearhead found in Ukraine, supposedly dated to the early 3rd century of the Common Era, which would explain the use of such a rune given that the south of the territory in the Black Sea was partially controlled by the Romans, the Greek colonies having been finally controlled by the Romans by that period. So there's a much nearer contact through trading with Romans, and so even though by this period that type of S rune had already fallen into disuse in Italic context, it may have endured for a longer period in other contexts, right? Well, sadly, this spearhead is gone as it was looted by the Nazis, so a replica was made, and this could lead into further discussion on how artifacts miraculously disappear to cover up forgeries, and then replicas of the real thing are made. Besides, if we take it to be a real thing, the inscription is in East Germanic Gothic, supposedly, and so the runes would be different to express different sound values, so not actually Proto-Norse, which makes all the difference. As you can see, the S rune is a complete nightmare, and we could be here discussing it for hours on end. So it's curious the use of different runes for the same letter in these inscriptions in the same context, which could mean a lot of different things, each done in different periods or done by different people, different contexts, etc. Anyway, another hypothesis: the stone doesn't date to the 5th century, the inscriptions at least, and it may be 7th, 8th century at the very least, since its dating was based on the local graves, as previously said, and so the stone itself may have nothing to do with the graves. Or the stone may have been indeed a slab for a grave, but without descriptions, and the inscriptions are the ones that have nothing to do with the graves, and the surface was used to inscribe these runic sequences and formulas for a completely different purpose on another period and in different contexts and meanings not directly linked to the 5th century grave site. Another and final hypothesis: the SueuS inscription is a later addition, given the use of runes and why why the choice of S is so different from the first inscription. When was this runic inscription added? It isn't clear. But between the two inscriptions, it is clear that SueuS was neither done by the same person nor with the same tool. The person who inscribed SueuS was surer of hand and purpose. At first glance, it seems to me, again, this is a context I would like very much to have a closer look at in real life. Too many uncertainties for this context, which is just maddening and unhelpful. The SueuS word may originally have been based on some meaningful term, but it is not entirely clear what that may have been. It has, of course, been suggested that it's a term in relation to the Germanic tribe ᛋᚢᚖᚖᚋ, because they inhabited this region of Sweden. I think this is too far-fetched. Indeed, Tacitus mentions the ᛋᚢᚖᚖᚋ in the 1st century of the Common Era. There's the SueuS and the ᛋᚢᚖᚖᚋ in the 6th century of the Common Era, and a long history of the Iron Age Swedes until at least the year 1000 of the Common Era. Doesn't seem to be a reference to any person or people or tribe. Doesn't even make sense. Besides, the great majority of the names of Iron Age tribes and peoples are of Roman origins. People didn't call themselves these names. The Picts, as an example in what is now Scotland, were thus called by the Romans, and we don't know how the Picts called themselves. The Lusitanians were called that name by the Romans. The Celts in general, Celts being a Celt, the Celts were called by classical authors. The Gauls, likewise, the long list of Celtic and Germanic tribes were called like we know them nowadays by classical authors. So to me, doesn't make sense this inscription being in reference to specific tribes or peoples, because why on earth would they call themselves and write or inscribe or carve on stone names that they themselves did not identify themselves with? The likely scenario here, given the fact that it is on an Iron Age grave site, and assuming the stone is not a forgery, or assuming that the SueuS inscription itself isn't a forgery, it appears to have had an amuletic purpose, as some authors have suggested, that it may have been a magical protection against thieves, much like the inscription on the ᛋᚢᚖᚖᚋ stone from Norway, for instance, and as an example, a very good example actually. It's a complex example, but it is a good example of a rune stone with an amuletic purpose. But taking the inscription together, it seems to have been indeed a whole expression against thieves breaking into the grave at ᛋᚢᚖᚖᚋ in Norway. Grave robbing wasn't uncommon, and certainly it was happening quite often in these contexts. So, to the stone, the Kylver Stone, it may have been added later on the text SueuS in a later period, possibly 7th, 8th century onwards, which coincides with the period of the ᛋᚢᚖᚖᚋ stone from Norway, if we take into consideration that S Rune, instead of being meant to be the lightning bolt one, was meant to be the other S Rune of a later period, and it's just a question of being hard to carve the symbol on a hard surface, so it looks like another S, which is actually a poor excuse, I'll admit, as the other runes were very well carved. But the purpose here, as a plausible hypothesis, if we compare it with other contexts, may have been indeed to protect against grave robbers. We are talking about a grave context of the 5th century, and it isn't entirely improbable adding a runic inscription linked to that grave context, but on a much later period. This has to do with the fear of the ancient dead from rising from their graves if they are disturbed and their objects stolen. So it wouldn't be that far-fetched that the people of the 7th, 8th centuries, centuries later on, having fear of the dead of the 5th century. It's a period of 200, 300 years after the grave context. Probably no one had knowledge when those people had been buried or who were those people. So it's just a question of feeling like it's very ancient, so better not disturb the unknown ancient dead, and so a later formula is inscribed to prevent grave robbing, which by itself prevents the wrath of the ancient unknown dead. Of course, it may equally have had a different magical function or several magical functions, obviously, as several of the funerary stones inscribed in younger runes bear curses. Researchers have pointed out as a parallel the younger inscription comparable to this one found in Kylver Stone, which appears on a rune stone from Flemløse in Denmark, 700 to the 800 of Common Era, further indicating SueuS as a later addition, which also features a palindrome, which is SueuS. This palindrome is right after the name of a person, so the entire inscription is something like Rufre or Ruchre, SueuS. SueuS resembles the old Saxon word sisu, precisely, magical incantation. This inscription was found along with another inscribed stone that marks its funerary context, and it was in memory of this person, this Rufre, Rolf or Rolf, who was a priest. So SueuS and SueuS here may be indeed with the intent to protect the deceased from grave robbers, from thieves, or it could just as well be a warning indicating that it is a curse to keep people away and or to avoid robbing the grave. For instance, in later periods, in the Viking Age, curses served as warnings, not cursing people, but just warnings, not directly cursing anyone, not yet, but warning that if people would touch, come closer, or disturb, they would get cursed. The warning alone was enough to cause fear and keep people away. In fact, I have talked about that before on another video, precisely dealing with runic curses. So, this is a possible interpretation for SueuS, the palindrome, as a possible magical runic formula, by comparing it with other contexts from later periods. So, if it wasn't a forgery, SueuS may have been added to the stone possibly in the 8th, 9th century, no earlier than the 7th century. And this is a good thing, it is a good sign, which indicates that it may not be a forgery after all, precisely due to these parallels. Which is comforting, but there are still too many questions left without an answer, and so it is still open to interpretations, as long as we can back those interpretations with some evidences. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed today's video. I really hope this was useful and perhaps a little bit of a mind opener, so to speak, in relation to runes and their meanings, because even though much has been studied concerning the runes, runology, runestones, etc., there are still a lot of doubts, as you can see, and many questions left unanswered. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.